Welcome back to our continuing coverage of the impeachment trial of President Trump. We remain in an informal recess, technically a quorum call on the floor of the Senate, as they try to iron out the details of the schedule and where we go from here. We are awaiting a vote on a motion that would allow, or in this case, as we expected, deny witnesses to be called in the trial of President Trump. While we wait for the resumption of the session and for them to continue the deliberations and the vote, I want to go through some of the poll numbers surrounding impeachment. And we showed this to you earlier, but here are the latest numbers on those who say they want witnesses in the Senate trial. These are the 5 most recent major polls. The lowest percentage is 69%. The highest percentage is 80%. The average of these polls, 73%. And the last time the Congress just walked away from something 73% of the public wanted, well, it would probably be a gun issue, now that I think about it. Right. How should the Senate vote in the trial? There you saw the split in the latest Quinnipiac poll, and you can also see the numbers among the different parties. Let's move on to the Trump explanation. Are you satisfied with his explanation? 6 in 10 Americans just about say they want more details out of the president. Only 38% say they're satisfied with the president's explanation of what he was doing in Ukraine. Abuse of power. This is Article 1, which we anticipate a vote on from the Senate come Wednesday, if not sooner. More than half of all Americans think the president abused his power. Slightly over half of all Americans believe he obstructed Congress. That is the thrust of Article 2 of the impeachment articles. Is the president telling the truth about his actions in Ukraine? A majority of Americans say he is not. Most Americans, though, have made up their minds about their positions when it comes to this trial. In fact, 9 out of 10 Americans say their mind is made up. Only 10% of Americans still thought, as of last week, that they might change their minds. Let's compare that, though, and some of the numbers we've seen to where we were in January of 1999, the impeachment trial of President Clinton. And you saw the numbers much, much different. We are going to talk about those poll numbers in just a little bit, but it appears as though that the Senate is about to gavel back into session as we keep an eye there. Everybody just took a seat, so let's go back to the Senate chamber and Mitch McConnell.
Have a discussion, and it leads to the following. We'll now cast a vote on the witness question, and once that vote is complete, I would ask that the Senate stand in recess, subject to call of the chair.
Thank you. Without objection, so ordered. The question is, shall it be in order to consider and debate under the impeachment rules any motion to subpoena witnesses or documents? The yeas and nays are required under Senate Resolution 483. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. No. Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mrs. Blackburn. No. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. No. Mr. Braun. No. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Burr. No. Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Mrs. Capito. No. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Cassidy. No. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. No. Ms. Cortez Masto. Aye. Mr. Cotton. No. Mr. Kramer. No. Mr. Crapo. No. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Daines. No. Ms. Duckworth. Aye. Mr. Durbin. Aye. Mr. Enzi. No. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mr. Gardner. No. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Graham. No. Mr. Grassley. No. Ms. Harris. Aye. Ms. Hassan? Aye. Mr. Hawley? No. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Aye. Mr. Hoven? No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith? No. Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Johnson? No. Mr. Jones? Aye. Mr. Kane? Aye. Mr. Kennedy? No. Mr. King? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Langford? No. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Lee? No. Mrs. Loeffler? No. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. McConnell? No. Ms. McSally? No. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Moran? No. Ms. Murkowski? No. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Perdue? No. Mr. Peters? Aye. Mr. Portman? No. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Roberts? No. Mr. Romney? Aye. Ms. Rosen? Aye. Mr. Rounds? No. Mr. Rubio? No. Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Sass? No. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? No. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? No. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Shelby? No. Ms. Sinema? Aye. Ms. Smith? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Sullivan? No. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Tillis? No. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Udall? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Wicker? No. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 49. The nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
And there you have it, a vote almost entirely along party lines to reject the idea of adding witnesses to this Senate trial. The only crossover votes that we had were the ones we expected. Mitt Romney and Susan Collins, the two Republicans who voted yes. All 47 Democrats, which includes the two independents who caucus with the Democrats, voting in favor of witnesses. The final vote being 51 to 49. I will point out that 3 Democrats took very tough votes there. Doug Jones out of Alabama, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, and Kyrsten Sinema out of Arizona, voting with their party despite the potential electoral pressures that they may face as a result of that. One other observation of my own, the Senate has been running these cameras. I didn't think it was an accident that as Mitt Romney stood to vote yes for witnesses, they changed the camera angle so that we could not actually see him do that on camera. We continue to be joined by Rick Unger as we go through, and we're going to be taking your phone calls in just a moment. And again, the vote just happening in the U.S. Senate. We're going to keep going just as we're joined by another guest who is with us, Roland Riopelle, who is a former federal prosecutor who has been with us from time to time. And we will have more from them. There you see the happy family all together.
Lots to talk about.
First of all, I mean, your reaction to what we just saw and how this trial has played out.
It's really depressing to somebody who understands the law and the Constitution and how things are actually supposed to work. My own view is that what's happened is we're suffering under a terrible tyranny of the minority right now, Andrew. Old white men are desperate to maintain their control of the country.
Go easy on old white men.
And I'm older than I look, so I'm one of them.
I'm not sure which part of that I should be objecting to.
And what we're seeing is a group of senators who are so terrified of a populist president and the rabid base that he has incited, that they are afraid to do their duty to uphold the Constitution. I think the conduct that they have basically admitted occurred, and that I do think the House has proven pretty completely, is conduct that warrants, certainly warranted articles of impeachment and, a real debate as to removal. And it's very hard to see how you could have a real debate without the testimony of the further witnesses that the House managers were asking for.
I woke up with a sobering thought this morning, which was that 50 years later, I had the sense that Richard Nixon was having his revenge to some degree, because the arguments that we heard in defense of President Trump, if applied to President Nixon, would have basically allowed the cover-up if he thought it was in the best interest of the nation, and if he didn't order the break-in, if he wasn't directly responsible for the break-in, you wouldn't have been able to peg that to him either. And in those 50 years, one of his aides, Roger Ailes, wound up starting Fox News originally with the goal of representing conservative causes, and I think he has said over the years, or had said over the years, because of Nixon. I wonder if that parallel makes sense to you as well.
Oh, 100%. Indeed, I would argue that what we just saw could never have happened but for the existence of Fox News as a staunch defender and propaganda arm of the very far-right conservative movement. I don't think Mr. Trump would have the rabid base or the megaphone that he does have without the support of Fox News. And that is the difference between now and the days of Richard Nixon, when you had only 3 channels and all of them were committed to trying to play it down the middle.
I do think, though, that we have to be careful not to give the constitutional arguments that were made too much credence. Dershowitz himself did not believe these arguments. You know, what,
that's right.
What made it so strange is that, you know, listen, we're lawyers. I don't know if you're a lawyer.
Nope.
And we know that you will change an argument to match a client's situation.
Sure.
That's our job. We can argue one thing one day, the exact opposite the other day. What we don't do, though, is go on television to do it, because it has a different impact. The impact of what Dershowitz was arguing, if we go back to the beginning, listen, we all use the same notes. We all use James Monroe's notes of those 3 months when it was being discussed amongst the framers. We know what they say. So does Dershowitz. He saw those notes too. It is not going to gain any priority. It is not going to become precedent, and certainly what he had to say in the past couple of days will not.
So then what is the lasting takeaway from this trial, other than the direct impact on Donald Trump? He gets to stay in office. He gets to remain on the ballot this November. Is it oversight? Is it, Roland, are you concerned that by rejecting these articles of impeachment that the Congress is basically abdicating its oversight responsibilities? Now the White House can say, no, we're not giving you documents even if you're holding hearings?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think that, you know, the People's House, the House of Representatives, will continue to assert its oversight role, and now will go to the courts and pursue subpoenas if it has to, and do other things to renew the oversight that's necessary here. But I do think Mr. Trump, who is a pretty simple person ultimately, will feel very much emboldened by this result. He knows he has the Republicans in the Senate behind him, so that he really won't be removed in the next 10 months, no matter what he does. But a lot can happen in 10 months in terms of getting the information out to the people, and I'm sure that the House of Representatives is going to do all that it can, including going to the court system to enforce subpoenas to do that. You know, and we'll see how that plays out.
We're going to go back to the Capitol right now. I understand Senator Ron Wyden is speaking. Let's see what he's saying after this vote.
I will look at every opportunity to make sure that the relevant witnesses and the relevant facts get out. I will tell you that is going to happen regardless of what position I take, and I think it will happen sooner rather than later. At the rate in which we're going, practically every single day, there is another development. It is not a small development, it's a major development. So I'm not going to stand before you and say my position on urging people to do X, Y, and Z is most relevant. I think at the rate we're going to see significant development. Some people say, well, there'll be books and the like months and years from now. I think it's going to continue to be something we see every day. Okay, got to get in.
Senator Wyden there giving his comments, and he hit on something that is going to be a topic of conversation, so let's get into it now, which is the revelations that we know are, oh, we got sound from Richard Blumenthal, back to the Capitol.
Final vote, but there is no vindication here for anyone, and frankly, as I sat there on the floor voting, I thought about all the reasons I wanted to be a senator, all the respect I had for this institution, all the high images and expectations I had, and I was so bitterly disappointed in my colleagues for voting uniformly in parts of it, putting party in the country.
Do you share the concern that some of your colleagues have said that the president will look at what happened here today and think, well, I can just keep doing this?
The guardrails are potentially gone, in Donald Trump's mind at least, which means we have to renew our commitment to those checks and balances that are the reason that we did this impeachment in the first place. The whole reason for the impeachment of Donald Trump was because he has contempt for the rule of law. He impounded funds, he obstructed justice, he stonewalled Congress, and he committed corrupt abuse of power, and that was shown.
Is it your expectation that Republicans will try to get the acquittal vote done tonight as soon as possible, and just try to get it out of the way?
I know that some of my colleagues want to rush it, want to just do it, get it done. The most historic act that most of us will ever take as a member of the United States Senate, they want to do in the middle of the night. And that is really disgraceful and shameful. As I sat on the floor of the Senate to cast my vote, I thought how absolutely disgraceful it is for the free press doing the investigative work that the United States Senate is too cowardly to do in uncovering the wrongdoing that will continue to come out. Thank goodness for the free press and our independent judiciary. They're going to be the heroes of this era because the truth will keep coming, and my colleagues will be honored by it.
Thanks. Can you talk about what exactly is being negotiated right now? What's your understanding of the state of play? What do Democrats want? What are Republicans not giving you at this point?
We want an opportunity for full, fair, open, I stress open debate. I have a motion to open the deliberations, which otherwise would be secret, along with my colleagues Durbin and Brown, and the American people have a right to see what we say, not just how we vote.
How many Republicans do you have on that with you, do you think?
We have no Republicans with us.
Do you think you're going to be able to get that through or agree to?
See, after declining to hear evidence, barring witnesses and documents, I don't know how my Republican colleagues can shutter the debate and, in effect, determine the future of the president behind closed doors. Makes no sense.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
All right, Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut there. Just before him, we heard Senator Ron Wyden speaking, both Democrats, both obviously upset, both also mentioning President Trump and what he might do, feeling unconstrained now, having survived impeachment or soon to have survived impeachment. And we're going to get into this as our coverage continues, but I'm curious first, Rick, are you worried about what the president does now, feeling unconstrained? Should we as a nation be worried?
Well, I've been worried for a long time, in all seriousness. I've seen this president do things without constraints, and we all know what they are. And it's disconcerting. It's from a policy point of view, troubling. It's not the way domestic or foreign policy should ever be conducted by a president. Now we know that he is going to truly be footloose and fancy-free, especially in the months leading up to the election. And I think we all have to be vigilant right now.
And Roland, if we needed anything else to worry about, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was in Kiev today meeting with Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. What perfect timing. Are you concerned between now and...
Yeah, it's frightening to think that the president in the middle of this proceeding was soliciting election help from China. You wonder what he and Vladimir Putin are talking about right now. You wonder what the Russians will do to interfere with our election in November if they can, and they probably can, because the president will, drag his feet in terms of protecting the vote. It's a frightening situation. We're really at the cusp of an autocracy, and the only thing now standing between us and that are the voters. And the president, who is a very self-interested person, is going to do all that he can to make sure that the voters can't stop him.
So let me reset for everybody at home where we are, what's happening, and what the game plan is. The Senate has just voted 51-49 not to allow witnesses into the impeachment trial of President Trump. They have since taken a recess, and from everything we can tell, they are meeting behind closed doors, trying to figure out what the process and procedure is going forward from this point. Now, the Democrats will have the opportunity to make additional motions today, possibly about documentary evidence. They may try again for witnesses. There may be other manipulations. And the thinking is they're going to try to keep this night going for quite some time. There's also been reporting about a plan that would pick this up next week, let the Senate go dark tomorrow, And then on Monday, we start picking it up with closing arguments. Tuesday would be statements from senators with a final vote on Wednesday, the day after the State of the Union address. We're waiting for them to come out of recess to give us that information. We are then going to have extended coverage as we wait for that. We will take your phone calls, and we will also do analysis both of what this means in terms of the impeachment trial and going forward. We're going to take a quick break here. Our night's continuing coverage of the impeachment of Donald Trump continues after this.